Hi there, my name is Max Baybak, and I'm the Chief Strategy Officer at Influx Marketing. We are a digital marketing agency that's focused primarily on the field of aesthetics, plastic surgery practices, and medical spas, with offices in Los Angeles, Salt Lake City, and Tampa, Florida. Today, I'm joined by my business partner and the CEO of our company, Mr. Adam Daniels.
Hey, everyone.
And Adam and I wanted to just kind of do a talk on a subject that's been being discussed a lot in the media recently, the Google antitrust suit, and kind of unpack it a little bit and give you our thoughts on what it might mean for aesthetic practices moving into the future. And there are a number of other situations or kind of trends occurring in tech news that we think play into this. And we're going to kind of unpack each of these for you. So what we'll be going over today is the Google antitrust suit, some of the dynamics that are occurring between Apple and Facebook right now, and a little something that Apple's cooking up on the sidelines that actually plays right into this trend with Google and the antitrust suit. And most importantly, what it all means for you and what we think practices should be doing to be prepared for any potential fallout or outcome from this suit.
So I'll talk about the first part here, which so you guys may have all seen in the press in the last month. It first came up that the Department of Justice filed for an antitrust suit against Google, and there's different opinions of that action. For some people, like particularly in the tech industry, it's a little bit of a head scratcher because of all the different areas that Google could have an antitrust suit potentially filed on them for. Really, what this antitrust is going after is their practice on having their search engine preloaded on mobile phones, or they are paying certain amounts of money, for example, to Apple to make sure that Google as a search engine is the default search engine on your mobile device when you buy an iPhone, things like that. Similarly with Firefox, which is a very prominent browser, Google pays Firefox to have Google as the search engine for that browser as the default. So that's really the main angle that the Department of Justice filed this antitrust suit on. And another aspect of it is, if you think about it, when it comes to mobile searches, if they have the iPhone pretty well there with Google searches as the primary search engine that you get on your phone, and Google also owns Android and has the Android, the other 50 to 60% of all mobile devices sold, and they have Google as a search engine on that, you can kind of see that they have a 90% stranglehold on search engines as a default in the US market. So the Department of Justice has a task to show that by that action, it's technically not illegal to have a monopoly, but it's illegal to abuse that power. And that's the main point, is they're saying that they're starting to abuse that power to thwart innovation. That's the case that they're going to have to make. And ultimately, we don't really know where this is going to go. It's honestly going to play out over the next probably year, maybe more. And it might settle, it might go to court. But as a marketing company, we're watching this very closely because there's really a few directions we could see it going. And if anything, it's going to probably change the landscape a little bit of how digital marketing and how consumers use digital search in order to find things. And we want to make sure that we're ahead of that.
For example, Adam, you mentioned the DOJ is going to have to make the case and actually present a strong case that Google is actually harming the consumer by thwarting innovation. And some examples of that are like DuckDuckGo, for example, is a search engine that does serve ads, but that doesn't track your activity. And there's another one that's actually cited, I believe, in the case where it's a subscription-based search engine. So these are potentially new models for search that really have no ability to get a foot in the door because of Google's position and the monetized relationships that it has with Apple and Firefox, as you mentioned, and the owning of Android. And so that's really the case that they're trying to make here. Would you say that summarizes it accurately?
Yeah, that does summarize it accurately. And a part of it, without getting into all of the technical side of Google's search engine, is that in order to become and stay a really effective search engine, it requires people using your search engine. So for example, the more someone used DuckDuckGo or one of these other services, the better that product would be, whereby using this broad securing of their search engine and the scale that they get, it makes it so that their search engine, it might be a better experience for people, but it makes it so that other search engines that might actually be a very good experience, they don't have the scale that they need to be able to show that they're a better experience. So anyway.
Yeah, and I think that also speaks to Google's stance, which is that this would harm the consumer, not help the consumer, because they would have a decreased quality of experience. However, the question is, are there better experiences out there on the data privacy side and so forth that the consumer would prefer, that really have no ability to get any legs because of Google's dominant position? So that would sort of be their stance or that would be the opposing stance to Google's.
For sure. And one other thing, yeah, exactly. One other thing I'll add to that is, it says on here in Google's favor. So it might surprise some people who are listening to this, but every year, Google pays somewhere in the range of $8 to $12 billion to Apple for having their search engine on the iPhone. That is a huge amount of money. They pay Firefox a huge amount of money in order to have their search engine on there. And so much so that apparently even not Firefox, which is a nonprofit company, the IRS has had to figure out what to do with that, because they made so much money off of those interactions that it's more than nonprofits have ever made, basically, or something along those lines. The reason why that's interesting is because this antitrust case sort of already played out a little bit in Europe, actually, over the last few years, and the end result of it was that they were mandated that they had to let the consumer make a choice of what their default search engine was. So for example, when you're setting up your phone, rather than just going into a browser and Google's already there, you have to pick if you're going to go with Google, if you're going to go with DuckDuckGo, let's say, or one of the other search engines that's out there, Bing, for example. And while that's a sort of where most people are expecting this is going to go, because this is the only area that they're getting this antitrust case on. There's other areas regarding ads and other places that it's not really the primary focus of this antitrust. But the end result is that's what ended up happening, and then most consumers still just picked Google. So that's
in terms of why it's a benefit to Google, though. Google, if we didn't already make it clear, is paying $8 to $12 billion a year to Apple to be the default search engine within the Safari browser. So if you go into your Safari browser and you type in something that's not a website, but just a search term or phrase into the address bar, it automatically sends that search to Google. And that's the relationship that Google has with Apple, which is basically what's in the crosshairs by the DOJ in this antitrust suit. In essence, if this plays out the way it did in Europe, users would have the ability to pick their own search engine. That relationship between Apple and Google would have to essentially dissolve. And the majority of people are likely to just select Google because it is the best experience. They do have the most data. And so in a weird way, Google might end up benefiting from this because that's a huge amount of money that doesn't have to go out the door. And yet they're still getting all these users using Google. Now, for Google, that's really not that much money. But what's interesting is that for Apple, it actually represents a healthy amount of their profit because it all falls immediately to the bottom line. It's something like, am I correct in saying, Adam, it's about 15% of?
Yeah, it's like 10 to 15% of their profit margins on a yearly basis come from that, which would be more of a hit to Apple and more of a savings to Google if this plays out that way. So,
which is really interesting. So that speaks to what some of the other potential models that could emerge out of this, what they might be. In some senses, it seems like this might have a lackluster ending where there's just a little pop-up box when you get your new device, when you open a Safari browser or another browser, and it says, which search engine would you like to default? And you pick Bing or Yahoo or Google or DuckDuckGo. And that might just be the end. And it doesn't seem that exciting. It doesn't seem like it changes anything for us as marketers or for you and your patient acquisition strategy. But we like to watch these things really closely because there are some nuances that we want to be ahead of in case potentially new ways, new models emerge. So some of the things that are being talked about, we don't know yet if Apple will embrace these, is potentially a bidding system between the search engines. So if I'm a user and I go into Safari and I type in a search term, it would actually say, hey, Bing, hey, Yahoo, hey, Google, which one of you wants to bid the most for this search? And actually Apple would make their 8 to 12 billion probably just in a more roundabout way where there is a choice involved, which would, obviously put an end to any antitrust argument if they're giving the choice to several companies. And Google will probably be the one that pays the market rate because they have the most money and they have the most means, and it'll end up falling back to Google. But it's quite interesting to think that there might be some sort of a bidding system like that, and there'd be other search engines that come a little bit more into the forefront as a result. So these are the type of potential model shifts that we're watching. So as marketers, we can be prepared for it.
Great. One other thing I'll add to that is in the news that's been coming out on the whole antitrust side of things, there's been some mentions, and we're watching this closely. It's not the subject of this talk, but Facebook and Apple and even potentially Amazon, there's been rumblings of maybe potential antitrust suits coming their way. And nothing firm on that yet, but something we're watching since there's a bit of a wave of these happening right now or being considered.
Yeah, and we find these things fascinating as marketers because, again, these potentially open up new cracks for other companies to get a foothold, and then they might become more meaningful parts of a patient acquisition strategy based on changes that otherwise wouldn't have occurred, but due to regulation, these changes can occur. Another trend we're watching right now, which is really separate, but you'll see kind of how it ties back into the macro trend that we're seeing in the digital marketing space, is a little bit of contention between Apple and Facebook. In this case, I think it's no secret, Apple's kind of core value proposition to the consumer is privacy, not selling your data, keeping your data very protected. And several years ago, they started with ad blocking in the Safari browser. And now there's a new thing that's been being discussed. You might have caught some of this in the media, where they were threatening to come out with a new feature in iOS 14, which would block cross-app tracking. It may be surprising, but some people don't always realize that, what you're doing in certain apps is actually on your phone is actually being utilized by other apps on your phone. A prime example is Facebook actually seeing what you're doing in terms of your web browsing. This is how you're web browsing something and all of a sudden you start seeing ads for that same thing. Because they're actually tracking what's happening in your browsing apps. So this would create a pretty big hit. We don't think it would be an existential threat to Facebook's advertising model. However, we do think it would definitely create a dent in the efficacy of Facebook's targeting. So this would be a big hit to Facebook. Because of Facebook essentially begging Apple and other apps as well, kind of making a stink about this, Apple has delayed that feature. They did not roll it out with iOS 14 until 2021. Facebook's stance is that it's currently unfair to many small businesses that rely on Facebook marketing to acquire new business, especially during a global pandemic. So I think that's why Apple softened on it a little bit, but that's something we're definitely watching, and we're seeing how that plays out because it will definitely change your Facebook strategy to some degree. We don't know quite yet how. Exactly what that means, but it's something that you want to make sure your marketing team is paying attention to. If you're reliant on Facebook leads, you may not be, but in the case that you are, that's something to be aware of. And then that all kind of ties back in to how Apple is sort of pushing its way into, traditionally we haven't thought of Apple as a major marketing platform or a channel for patient acquisition, but it's quite interesting to think about some of these things that are happening with Apple, and I'll turn it over to you, Adam.
Yeah, so I mean, it goes without saying that often Apple iPhone users are high valued consumers to reach. They typically demographically have higher incomes, and it's someone that you definitely want to reach. So some interesting moves have happened, which I would not be surprised if many of you have not heard of this, but 2 years ago, Apple actually hired away from Google their senior vice president of search, their main engineer who led all of their search efforts and oversaw their search engine development. Might seem like an odd effort for Apple to hire him, but this is Apple's big play. It started with them making Apple Maps, which you may remember initially became a little bit of a not a great product for them, and it had a little bit of, they got some flack on it. But ultimately, they've managed to bring that product up to a point where it's become a substantial competitor with Google Maps. Apple is basically creating a search engine. And her name is Siri. She already exists right now in voice, but there is much talk going around, especially in relation to this antitrust suit and where this is going with Google, that if Apple's going to lose $8 to $12 billion a year potentially, that them making their own search product, even potentially a browser-based search, is where this is likely going, is what a lot of indicators that we're seeing are pointing to. It's not necessarily guaranteed, but because obviously Apple is notoriously private about their product releases and things that they're working on, but there's enough indicators to show that there is minimally some effort happening. Maximally, it's going to be a full-blown browser-based search engine, voice-based search engine, and a full competitor with Google. There is an indicator for us where Apple developed this, without getting into the technicalness of it, there's something called a bot, which basically crawls the internet and crawls different pages of every different website. And Apple created what's called AppleBot, which Google has Googlebot, to crawl the internet some years ago. In recent months, the AppleBot has been substantially more active across the internet, where what it does is it crawls and indexes the entire internet, which, to give you an idea, is between 30 to 50 billion pages in its active index. So it's a lot to get all of that together to actually have a viable search engine.
And I think a key thing to note, we talked about this, is that the funds and the means required to actually properly index the entire internet are immense. And so we talked about another company previously, DuckDuckGo, which offers a privacy-based search option. Well, it's important to note that DuckDuckGo does not have its own index of the internet, that they actually license it, I believe from Yahoo. And so it's interesting to note that there's really only so many companies out there with the means to create an index. There are those who would say Apple is way too far behind and will never compete with Google. But if anyone does have the means to do it, it would be Apple. It's also interesting to note that it could go a couple different ways. It could be web-based. It could be voice-based. That's why Adam, he mentioned Siri. That's what he's referencing there, is we already have voice-based search within your Apple device. And the search results, you can get local results right now if you ask Siri for a restaurant nearby you, or even for a plastic surgeon nearby you. The results are not refined. They're not fantastic. We've looked at this closely, but those are Apple's results. They're not using Google's results and serving them up to you on the results page there. So they're already doing their own indexing. Whether they saw an antitrust coming and saw that they would lose this revenue, or simply they saw an opportunity, this is definitely seems to be quietly being pieced together by them over time. And it'll be very interesting to see what they do. There's many who have said, it's kind of in Apple's ethos to not run advertising, but there is some precedent for Apple ads. Namely, it would be in the App Store. You can, if you have an app, run an ad right now. And what Apple has been rolling out for some time is a kind of a new sort of paradigm shift that we sort of call opt-in marketing, where Apple is not saying you can't get marketed to, but they're giving the consumer the choice. And so we could see them following that same route and making it so that they can maybe make a shift on their previous ideas and ideology around advertising, and maybe they will do their own advertising, but just give you the option to opt in or out and say, hey, we're going to make these searches better if you allow us to track information. Okay, yes, and if the Apple device user says yes, then they would actually have all the same strengths as Google, but they're making sure you're opted into it, and we think that's potentially where they might be heading.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting. It's something we're watching very closely, because if you can imagine a landscape where, there's potentially millions of users using an Apple-based search, which could very well be coming, that's going to definitely change the landscape on how digital marketing is approached, how optimization is approached. We think some of these changes will significantly impact certain companies like Yelp. So we're watching all of this very closely to see how it rolls out. And my recommendation is, whether you're one of our clients or you're interested in talking to us about your marketing, or if you are working with a company that you really like, make sure that whoever you're working with is thinking with this. Again, it may not happen in the next few months. It might happen in the next 6 months, year, but it's something that, we like to be ahead of the curve on things like this.
Absolutely. So that kind of comes back to, what does all of this mean for you, for your practice? clearly this may not make, as Adam mentioned, a massive impact on Google in the near term. Likely, we think Google will retain its dominance. But just creating even a little crack in the door can open up the door for new channels over time. And we've long maintained that our clients should remain sort of digitally diversified to some degree. We've seen situations where people really had all their eggs in a particular basket in terms of patient acquisition, and something changes there. We sort of liken it to building your house on somebody else's land that you don't own, and that can be dangerous. So it's smart to make sure that you're diversified. This may open the door to more diversification because there's really been kind of a duopoly between Google and Facebook. If we're calling Instagram Facebook in that case, and so we think this could open up the door to some diversification opportunities. We're watching that closely. We do think there will be a new era of SEO. Whether Apple ends up actually creating a web-based competitor, a web-based search engine or browser-based that's a competitor to Google, that remains to be determined. But they're going to clearly continue to refine their current search, and based on the amount of people, and when I say current search, Siri, or it started years ago with Spotlight, and I don't think they call it that anymore, but there's still a search capability that does within your phone or your device or any of your Apple devices that crawls the internet and gives you internet results. Just based on the amount of people's pockets they're in, we think there'll be some success, and it'll become more relevant over time to be optimized for those types of searches. And another thing that this is kind of a little bit of a separate point, but we believe that as more players are getting into the search game, they're going to need to do more to vet and certify or validate the people, the physicians, the other service providers that they're recommending in their search engines. And so those types of things are going to matter. But that's almost kind of a subject for another webinar. So that's kind of what we see this might mean for practices, is just to make sure they're watching these trends and they're jumping on them, and there might be a chance to be early to the game a little bit as well. A little bit about us: we're a full service digital patient acquisition agency. Our core competency really lies in custom web design and search engine optimization and digital advertising. We also offer photo and video production, social media, email marketing, and so forth. Here's just a little sample of some of our work. You can also go to influxmarketing.com or contact us using any of the information here if you're interested in learning some more about our services, or if you just want to pick our brain on this topic or any other questions you might have about digital marketing, we'd be happy to answer. Again, my name is Max. This is Adam, Chief Strategy Officer and CEO of Influx Marketing. We'll be around for a little bit longer to answer any questions that you may have. Thank you so much for joining us today.
All right. Well, we hope you guys like that. We hope it was informative, and we actually already have a couple of questions that we can just jump right into and answer. So one of the first questions that we got was, what impact do you think an Apple search engine would have on new patient acquisition for aesthetic practices? So I can take that. We talked about it a little bit just in that segment, but the main thing that we think the impact it will have is, instead of just having sort of the most common approach now, which is Facebook and Google as your two primary sources of acquiring new patients, there's going to be a third player in the game, provided Apple does move ahead and actually create and launch this search engine product. So if that happens, whoever you're working with for marketing, if you're one of our clients, you can know that we are already moving ahead on making sure that we're watching those developments and that we're really focusing to ensure that that third avenue of patient acquisition, whether it's through ads or through optimizing for this new browser, is something that is an important strategy to ensure that, I mean, it goes without saying, Apple has large enough scale that if this does launch, there's a likelihood that it could develop some decent level of market share. And if that happens, it should be a viable source of really going after. So we would go after it to make sure that patient acquisition from that source is given the proper priority in order to make sure that there's no slowdown, or if anything, it might even offer an opportunity to increase certain patient acquisition if other people aren't to that game before you are in your practice. I don't know if you want to add anything to that, Max.
Yeah, one thing I would add to that is we touched upon this in our presentation, but one thing that's still unclear is exactly how Apple plans to implement their efforts. It's clear that there are significant efforts being made by Apple in the direction of a search engine, but that can manifest itself in a number of different ways. It's already been implemented, and we kind of talked about this already via Siri, via voice, and it may be that that's how they plan to really roll it out, or it may be that they have a browser-based consumer, that's open to anyone. That's probably the less likely scenario, but we're looking at all options. Even in the first case scenario, where it's simply in everyone's pocket and it's mostly voice-based. As it gets more, it exists now. You can look up a medical spa near me. You can look up a plastic surgeon near me, and you'll get results. They're not very sophisticated today. As it gets more sophisticated, even just that alone is going to mean something for practices to make sure that they're ahead of that and that they're showing up there. It's going to be hyper local, obviously, which is the same direction that Google has been moving for many years now. But even if it only manifests itself in that on that channel, we think it's going to be worth watching and putting some effort into.
Yeah, agreed. There's another question here, which you can take this, Max. I'll read it, which is, you mentioned Facebook ads and tracking. As an agency, do you recommend Facebook or Instagram ads over Google ads? Which do you find most effective?
Yeah, it's a great question. We do get asked this a lot, and I think people are really looking for, oftentimes are wondering, they just want to know what the superior product is. And the answer is that there really isn't, it depends on the use case. There's not just one superior tactic or strategy that applies in all cases. Most broadly speaking, what we would advise, what we tend to do with our own clients and when we're advising anyone, is to look to Google for their surgery patient acquisitions, surgical patients, and to look to Facebook and Instagram for their non-surgical. Now, it's a pretty broad categorization, but it tends to work pretty well that way. There are reasons to cross wires on that and to go the other way. But with Google, you get it's a higher cost, but that cost can generally be made up for with surgery. And you get a much higher intent as a result. And so for someone who's looking to do something that's a very considered purchase, like a surgery, you usually want that higher intent person. That's not so common to find from Facebook and Instagram. The other thing about Facebook and Instagram is that it doesn't 100% have to be this way, but I think it's pretty safe to say it's very much about offer-based marketing, because you're taking the person and you're distracting them off of whatever they were already, looking at on social media, their friends and their families' feeds. And you kind of have to give them something that grabs their attention. And we typically don't really recommend that, at least with our practices and our clients, we're not doing offers on surgery. So that's another reason. There are strategies for surgery on Facebook and Instagram, like perhaps maybe a little bit of a longer funnel play, like giving them a lead magnet or something that they can download, and then you nurture that. But typically we would say, look to Google for your surgery, look to your Facebook and Instagram for your non-surgical. We can unpack that more, but that's kind of my broad answer.
Excellent. Yeah, I have nothing to add to that. I completely agree with all that. Okay, good. Another question, which this is actually a question we get asked a lot more recently. There's kind of two that go together, so I'll read them. One is, I'm hearing a lot about TikTok. Is that something that I as a surgeon should be focusing on? And then a similarly related question, do you recommend physicians use new social media applications to market to a younger demographic? How important is it to be relevant? So I can speak to that, and then I'm sure Max will probably add some. There's a lot actually to discuss there. So TikTok, obviously, yes, the demographic, it's a hugely growing platform. It has the majority of the demographic on it is a younger demographic. And I think that there is a play there but it's a certain investment into creating the content and really becoming a content creator to become relevant on that platform. There's a whole way of how you produce content for TikTok that is relevant. I've seen some people do it really good, but you also have to realize what you're committing to. Not every surgeon out there or every med spa is like, it's not in their wheelhouse or their preference to become a real content creator and to become relevant on a platform like that. You really have to dedicate yourself to becoming...
Or to become a dancer.
Yes, to become a dancer. Exactly. That's what TikTok is often known for, but there is real dedication to content creation to become relevant on a platform like that. If you're trying to reach a younger audience, and for for example, primary breast aug or other sort of primary surgeries that might apply to a younger demographic like that, there is an avenue there to have discovery happen. But I don't know if you want to add anything on that, Max.
100%. I have a lot to say about this. You probably won't, if you've ever heard Adam or I speak at any of these conferences in person or digitally, you'll almost always hear us say that we liken marketing to investment. So you have to look at your own personal investment style. You have to look at what your time horizons are, what your risk, tolerances are. If you're long-term, you're early in your career, then you probably should be. It is also likely if you're early in your career that stuff makes a little more sense to you and feels more natural and native to you. So you just have to be aware of the fact that, hey, I'm putting this effort in, just like you put money into a stock, and I don't need it for 10 or 20 years, or maybe that's a little long, but maybe 5 years, versus something that you need back right away. So you have to think about your time like money. That's how marketing should always be looked at. And to that point, also, if you look at an investing world, they advise you to invest in what you know and invest in what is natural to you and what you just have a natural affinity and gravitation towards. That's the same here. There's a million marketing strategies. So you might be more of a writer type and you want to write some more scholarly articles, and you can publish those on Medium. And that's another platform for blogging and can be utilized and leveraged for SEO. Maybe that's more your thing than doing TikTok or whatever it is. So I would advise people to look at what really feels good to them and where they feel like they can make the most contribution and add value to people. And that can be a marketing channel that you can invest in. And then it's fun and it doesn't feel like a chore. But if you do feel, if it is natural enough to you, TikTok and so forth, then go for it. And look at the long term. Because I remember when people were saying, is Instagram going to mean anything? And it did mean something for patient acquisition, but it really only meant it for those people who stayed at it for years. So you got to love it. You got to be willing to do it. I could go on, but I think that's enough on that.
Yeah, agreed on all that. All right, another question that's on here is kind of more of a broad question. What are you finding to be the most effective patient acquisition strategy overall these days? That's a pretty broad question, and I think that we could probably talk about that for an hour. But I think that to kind of summarize at a high level, I would say probably the biggest message that we push, we manage our own company this way for all of our different clients, and we push it for every physician we talk to or any practice that we're talking to, is to make sure that you're not only focusing on one channel for patient acquisition. You kind of need to, Max, you can probably talk to this too. We kind of have what we call a hub and spoke strategy, which is making sure that you have a strong website and then you have many different channels that feed into that website.
I will jump in on this because it goes again back to that investment concept. You want to be diversified. Don't be in on one channel, to echo what Adam just said. So a lot of channels, whether it be Instagram, Facebook, or really more Instagram, I would say Instagram, YouTube, maybe your website, maybe you're blowing up on TikTok right now. There's a lot of different channels, but it's pretty smart. We sort of liken it to when a person is building their real estate on land that they don't own. That can be a bit dangerous. So your website is the closest thing to something that you solely own on the internet. You really do. However, Google and your organic rankings can play a huge factor in how much traffic you get to that website. Your social media can play a huge factor, et cetera. So really just having that hub, when Adam was referring to the hub and spoke, your website is your hub, and having a really solid online presence is kind of, I think, the core to any strategy. And then you can tack onto that a number of different things without going, all in to a place where you're in a precarious position on any one given channel. That's kind of the way I would frame my answer to that.
Yep, absolutely. All right, another question that we have is, Google is an LLC organized and existing under the laws of Delaware and is headquartered in California. Do you think this will affect the outcome of this case? So this is in relation to the antitrust case. And, obviously I'm not a legal expert, but I have a decent understanding. I've read a whole lot about this antitrust, and I could say that while it's filed by, I think it's 11 or 13 attorneys general from different states, I don't think that that's going to substantially impact the outcome of this. I think that it's definitely at a federal level. And I think that, if there is some sort of a settlement or some sort of specific stipulation, or if it actually does all the way go to court and there's a final verdict as a result, I think that will probably impact how Google and its products interact across the country as opposed to state specific. But that's my, like I said, I'm not a legal expert on it, but that is my understanding of how it would probably result.
Then we just have a couple more minutes here, and I see there's one last question, unless any others pop up. And Adam, this is interesting because the suit is asking for a breakup or restructuring of the company. What do you foresee will be the outcome to the suit? So you, I think, have looked into this pretty deeply, Adam, but I'm not aware that that's really seems to be what the DOJ is after. I know typically antitrust is often thought of as, the remedies are often around restructuring or divesting. I'm not seeing that as their target here. What do you think?
Yeah, so before this, there was rumblings of this antitrust suit for a long time prior to it actually coming out just a handful of weeks ago. And that was some of the speculation. There was several different angles that people thought this antitrust case might end up being around. But like, for example, some of those did relate to breaking up or restructuring certain things. Some speculation was that YouTube was going to have to be divested or moved off into being its own company. Certain conversations about some of their ad products, like there was an ad product that they bought called AdMob, I believe, or in the early days of kind of building their infrastructure for ads. Some people thought, DoubleClick, exactly, like to have to be kind of parted off into its own thing. Ultimately, when the antitrust suit came out, really it was there are people in Silicon Valley and other places that they've kind of had, it's been a little bit of a head scratcher, because really what the focus of this antitrust suit is about is the abuse of their size and position to secure the search engine on mobile devices and on browsers, not really in relation to anything about YouTube. There's mentions of their ad products and so forth in the actual suit, but I don't honestly think that the outcome of this, and again, I can't divine the future, but I don't personally think that the outcome is going to be a divestment or forcing of splitting off certain assets or parts of the company. We will have to see.
Yeah, and we'll have to see. But in looking over the suit, it's clear that it's centering around Google throwing its weight around, and by that I mean money, at Apple, even acquiring Android early on and essentially dominating the default search engine on any browser, mostly mobile, but also in Safari on your desktop if you're using a Mac desktop or laptop device. And it seems like that's what they're really honing in on. And it seems like the likely outcome, as we talked about in the presentation, is simply that you're going to have a choice when you buy a new device as to which search engine. But the truth of the matter is, and that seems rather vanilla, and so this thing might come to pass without much result or fanfare, but we believe that it will begin to set the stage for other search engines to be relevant. And there has not been another relevant search engine to date. So it's something that is important for whoever is working on your SEO to be paying attention to, because all of a sudden, could be a few years from now, but other search engines are going to matter. And I think that's the key takeaway we'd like to give in terms of what the potential result could be. I think that's it for our time.
I think we're out of time, but I wanted to say thank you guys. And if you guys have any other questions, you can feel free to reach us through our website, influxmarketing.com. We'd be happy to answer any other questions that you guys may have. That's it.
Thank you. Enjoy the show.